In 2020, an area of land alongside the Jordan River, widely known as the West Bank, has once again become a focus of international attention. That's because of a long-running dispute over its ownership. It is known to Jews as the biblical region of Judea and Samaria, a central part of their ancient homeland. There are two main questions at the center of this dispute. Did Israel acquire control of the area by means of aggression? And does Israel have any rights to the land under international law? Let's examine some of the key facts with regard to the first question of acquisition by aggression. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3314 says that a war of aggression has no justification, is a crime against international peace, and cannot result in lawful territorial acquisition. The UN defines the aggressor as the first country to use armed force. Early in the morning of the 5th of June 1967, Israel carried out a preemptive strike against Egyptian forces and started what became known as the Six-Day War. That same day, Egypt's representative at the UN Security Council meeting claimed that Israel has committed a treacherous, premeditated aggression against the United Arab Republic this morning, while we have declared our intention not to initiate any offensive action. That view persists to this day among Arabs, as confirmed in many books and articles, for example this one that focuses on the origins and consequences of the war, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. It says that the Arabs view themselves as innocent victims, whilst they view Israel as an inherently aggressive and expansionist state, an outpost of Western imperialism. But is that view accurate? Does the historical evidence support it? Let's review some of the main events that led to Israel's preemptive strike, in order to answer the question, whose aggression was it that led to the change in control over this area of land? One significant event took place in 1964 with the setting up of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Note that this was done while the West Bank was still under Arab control. The Palestine that this organization wants to liberate was not the West Bank. The PLO's charter calls for Israel's destruction, and the organization was dominated by al-Fatah's leader, Yasser Arafat. In 1965, there were 35 terrorist raids against Israel, followed by another 41 in 1966, and 37 more in just the first 4 months of 1967. The targets of those raids were all civilian. Consequently, it was no surprise that in 1966 Israel struck back. Most of the terrorist attacks were supported by Syria, but launched from Jordan. When the Israelis finally retaliated, they decided to raid a community from which attacks were launched, the village of Al-Samu. Their plan was to demolish homes to punish that community, but to avoid causing any casualties. However, the plan went wrong, and as well as demolishing buildings, the Israelis became engaged in a battle with Jordan's army and air force. While Israel lost just 1 soldier in the fighting, Jordan lost 15 soldiers and a pilot. Afterwards, the Israelis admitted that the raid was a mistake, not just because of the casualties, but also because they struck at Jordan rather than Syria. Then, in January of 1967, the Syrians became more aggressive and used their positions on the Golan Heights to shell 2 Israeli kibbutzim. 1 Israeli was killed, and 2 more were wounded by a Syrian mine. Radio Damascus declared that Syria has changed its strategy, moving from defense to attack. We will carry on operations until Israel has been eliminated. Such threatening broadcasts by Syria became more and more frequent. Another one came in February 1967, when President Atassi of Syria said, "It is the duty of all of us now to move from defensive positions to offensive positions and enter the battle to liberate the usurped land. Everyone must face the test and enter the battle to the end. In April 1967, the Syrians fired on Israelis farming in a disputed zone, and Kibbutz Gadol was hit by more than 200 artillery shells. In response, the Israeli Air Force was sent in to neutralize the Syrian gun positions, but it was engaged by the Syrian Air Force as it did so. The first encounter resulted in 2 Syrian MiG fighters being shot down. Then a much bigger battle developed over the nearby Syrian capital of Damascus, with the Israelis again getting the upper hand and shooting down another 4 MiG fighters. Shortly afterwards, convinced that the Israelis were planning to attack Syria, the Egyptian army advanced into the Sinai Peninsula on the 14th of May, initially taking up defensive positions according to a predefined strategy. On the 15th of May, President Nasser released a statement saying, "Brothers, it is our duty to prepare for the final battle in Palestine." Then on the 16th of May, the Egyptians ordered the United Nations peacekeeping troops to leave the area. Surprised by these moves, Israel hastily mobilized its army and called up some of its reserves to face the Egyptian threat. Calling up reserves was not a trivial decision, because it meant bringing men away from their civilian jobs and thus had an adverse impact on the country's economy. Another surprise for both the Israelis and many other countries was that the UN peacekeeping force was withdrawn just 3 days later, with virtually no argument and no meeting of the Security Council. The following day, Syria's Minister of Defense, Hafez al-Assad, who would later become Syria's president, announced that Syria's forces are ready not only to repulse the aggression, but to initiate the act of liberation itself, and to explode the Zionist presence in the Arab homeland. This was just one more example of the threatening statements made by Israel's neighbours. Events were escalating, with their troops now occupying the Sinai. On the 23rd of May, the Egyptians announced the Straits of Tirana would be closed to all ships flying Israeli flags or carrying strategic materials. They also claimed that the straits had been mined. This was a major threat to Israel because 90% of its oil supplies passed through the Straits of Tirana. The Israelis had issued a clear warning that they would view such a move as an act of war. On the 25th of May, Egypt sent its 4th Division forward to offensive positions in Sinai and recalled 4 more brigades from the fighting in Yemen to reinforce its troops, bringing the total number of troops in Sinai to around 100,000. That build-up of forces was supported by Saudi Arabia sending troops towards Israel, and Iraq similarly preparing forces to join the Syrians near their border with Israel. By now, the Israeli Defense Forces were becoming more and more puzzled and anxious. They couldn't understand why they were just watching this enemy build-up and had not been sent into action. Paratrooper Yonatan Netanyahu summed up their feelings when he wrote home to his girlfriend saying, "We sit and wait. What are we waiting for?" The reason they were waiting was a difference of opinion among Israel's leaders. The military commanders were convinced that they needed to strike their enemies quickly before they launched an attack. But the Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, hoped to avoid war through political communications and was trying every option open to him. However, on the 28th of May, Egypt's President Nasser made a clear statement at a press conference, key phrases in which said, "We will not accept any coexistence with Israel. Today, the issue is not the establishment of peace between Arab states and Israel. The war with Israel is in effect since 1948. 2 days later, there came another surprise. On the 30th of May, King Hussein of Jordan flew to Cairo and signed a joint defense agreement with President Nasser. It was a surprise to foreigners and Egyptians alike, because Hussein was on good terms with Western governments, and just 2 days before, Nasser had called him an imperialist lackey. By now, all the signs for Israel were that a combined attack from at least 3 Arab armies was imminent. Exact numbers for the troops and equipment poised for battle are difficult to discern because there are significant differences between the various accounts. But when we consider some approximate numbers that lie between the extremes quoted, the Israelis are shown to have been significantly outnumbered. They had around 260,000 men with 900 tanks, 950 artillery pieces and 300 aircraft, whereas the Arab nations totaled somewhere around 325,000 men, 1,980 tanks, 1,400 artillery pieces and 550 aircraft. Now let's go back to that United Nations Security Council meeting when Egypt's representative claimed, "Israel has committed a treacherous premeditated aggression against the United Arab Republic this morning, while we have declared our intention not to initiate any offensive action." After all the threats, terrorism, shelling of civilian targets, blocking of Israeli shipping and military build-up, was that claim anywhere close to the truth of the situation? In 1980, when Menachem Begin had become Israel's Prime Minister, he summarized a very different view, saying, "The 1967 war was not an act of aggression, but of response to multiple acts of aggression designed to debilitate Israel step by step as a preliminary to outright war." The weight of evidence supports that view expressed by Menachem Begin. After all their own aggression, the Arabs' claim that Israel was the aggressor does not hold true. There were many terrorist raids against Israel, repeated bombardments of Israeli communities, the assembly of large armies close to Israel's borders, and the blockade of the port of Eilat, cutting off most of Israel's oil supplies. United Nations Resolution 3314 says that both bombardment and blockade are acts of aggression. So, according to the United Nations definition, the Arab nations were the aggressors. They forced the Israelis into a position which necessitated a response. This is the answer to the first of the two central questions regarding ownership of the West Bank. In part 2 of this series, we will consider the second question of whether Israel has any rights to the land under international law.